The second chapter in or the second part of the second chapter of the Principles book is called The Anticipations of Perception. And let me just take a moment to, well, in a sense, admire Kant's terminology. Right here we have the axioms of intuition, the anticipations of perception, the analogies of experience. I mean, how does he come up with this kind of terminology? Well, I guess only Kant knows that. I mean, we just lean back and enjoy it, right? I mean, these are not terms that were current in Kant's days or that, philosophers have picked up and everybody's using them. But it gives a particular charm to the critique of pure reason, I would say, that it has this really weird homemade terminology. All right, the anticipations of perception. Let me just read the second edition version of the principle. Its principle is, in all appearances, the real, which is an object of the sensation, has intensive magnitude, that is, a degree. Okay, let's start by thinking about the difference between an extensive magnitude and an intensive magnitude. So the axioms of intuition were supposed to be based on the fact that all appearances have an extensive magnitude. They are spread out in space and time. And when we think about space and time and being spread out in space and time, well, there's a magnitude there, right? There's a certain size, a length of time, a size in space. And this is the kind of magnitude that we can cut up into parts, right? And the whole just consists of bringing these parts together. So if air is a long length, like a kilometer, well, that consists of 1,000 meters, right? So this big length can be cut up into these also existing, right, as parts of it at the same time, these also existing smaller parts, which together build up the big thing. Okay, when Kant talks about an intensive magnitude, he is also talking about something to which the idea of number can be applied, where we have more and less. But it's a kind of magnitude that cannot be cut up in the same way. And so, for an example of this, think about brightness, right? I mean, there are lamps and other sources of light, and they can be more bright or less bright. So there's a lamp there in my room, and it's kind of bright, but it's a lot less bright than the sun when it's shining outside, and it's a lot more bright than the little green lamp that shows that my microphone is on. So there are larger and smaller degrees of brightness. But of course, the brightness of my lamp doesn't consist of a bunch of smaller brightnesses that are added together. Right? I mean, that doesn't really make any sense. If you feel pain, right, there can be a smaller or a larger pain in a sense, right? There can be more pain or less pain, but a more pain is not built up out of a lot of small pains, right? We can, there's a small pain and there's a small pain and there's a small pain, and together they form a large pain, a heavy, how do you call it? An intense pain. So that's the kind of thing that Kant is thinking about. Whenever something appears to us, whenever there's some kind of quality in my perception, and every perception is going to be a perception of some kind of quality, like brightness or green or like a certain tone or pain or anything like that, it's always going to be an intensive magnitude. Right? It doesn't make sense to say what is half of green, maybe, not in the sense that you could split up the green into two parts and say, oh, actually the green is just this plus that. But it does make sense to think of a whole scale of degrees of greenness, right? Maybe ranging from there's nothing to perceive there to there's a super intense green to perceive there, and there's all these degrees in between. That makes sense, and that is amenable to number, to mathematical treatment. We can see that as a magnitude. Okay. So here is Kant's proof. To be honest, this is, I don't know whether it really succeeds as a proof. It seems, to me it seems that Kant sort of more puts it forward as something that's kind of obvious once you think about it. Anyway, he calls it a proof. Perception is empirical consciousness, that is, one in which there is at the same time sensation. So perception for Kant here, what does it add to what we had in the axioms of intuition? In the axioms of intuition, there was like the bare form of space and time, its size. Now it's going to get filled in, right? It's going to get filled in with a sensation of red, of pain, of brightness, or whatever. Appearances as objects of perception are not pure intuitions like space and time, for these cannot be perceived in themselves. They therefore also contain, in addition to the intuition, which we talked about in the axioms of intuition, in addition to the intuition, the materials for some object in general, through which something existing in space or time is represented. That is, the real of the sensation as merely subjective representation, by which one can only be conscious that the subject is affected and which one relates to an object in general. Now, from the empirical consciousness to the pure consciousness, a gradual alteration is possible, where the real in the former entirely disappears and a merely formal consciousness of the manifold of space and time remains. Thus, there is also possible a synthesis of the generation of the magnitude of a sensation from its beginning. The pure intuition is zero to any arbitrary magnitude. So here is what Kant is telling us. So sensation is not, it's not really yet the conception of an object as such, but it's a necessary stage towards getting there. It gives us like the real of sensation as merely subjective representation, by which one can only be conscious that the subject is affected. So I know that I'm affected, right? I mean, I have this sensation of the green or the bright or the pain or whatever it is, and I'm relating it only, Kant says, to an object in general, right? To really think of it as an object, well, that's gonna need stuff like substance and causation and so on. But we're on the way there. Now, what is interesting about this, Kant says, about any of this qualitative element of perception, is that a gradual alteration is possible where the real entirely disappears and a merely formal consciousness remains. So what Kant suggests is this, right? Suppose that I have this sensation of this brightness, right? What I can imagine, what I can always imagine for any sensation is it's gradually becoming weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker until there's nothing left, right? Until I'm at the completely empty formal, like not filled in representation. I don't really think that Kant is giving us an argument for that, right? I mean, this seems to be, I mean, as far as I see, though I don't know, maybe other commentators disagree. As far as I see, he seems to be putting that forward as a sort of obvious thing, and maybe it is obvious, right? Whenever you have a sensation, you can sort of consider the same sensation like in a weaker or more intense way. And well, if that's possible, Kant says, so if we have this continuum from zero to whatever sensation I can have, then this is an intensive magnitude, right? This is precisely the kind of thing that I was thinking about when I was talking about intensive magnitudes just now. Thus, it has an intensive magnitude corresponding to which all objects of perception, insofar as they contain sensation, must be ascribed an intensive magnitude, that is, a degree of influence on sense. Okay, and this, once again, is going to make sure that we can apply mathematics to sensation. So we can apply mathematics to pure intuition, to space and time, but we can also apply mathematics to sort of what it is filled up with, to the sensation, right? We can measure that kind of stuff, right? We can measure brightness, we can give it numerical values, we can relate it to each other, theorize about it, using the entire language of mathematics, which Kant thinks is very nice, and of course it is only the transcendental system that can show us that this kind of application of mathematics to the appearances is necessarily possible. Now, let's read on. So a little bit further on, at the beginning of the where the A version starts, Kant tells us that since there is something in the appearances that is never cognized a priori, and which hence also constitutes the real difference between empirical and a priori cognition, namely the sensation, it follows that it is really this that cannot be anticipated at all. So here Kant makes the point that he doesn't want to say, in fact he denies that we could anticipate something like a priori, anticipate something like brightness or color or heaviness or pain. Right? We can't. That is what sensation gives us. This is where sort of Kant's empiricist strain is emphasized. We can't get any of that from pure thought alone. The only thing we can get from pure thought alone is that whatever sensation is going to pop up in our experience, it's going to allow of this intensive treatment, right? Of this diminishing and increasing, this thinking of it as a point on a scale from 0 to something else. So he tells us that it's not an extensive magnitude, and he tells us, again in the A version, sort of repeating what he says in the B version, prove that every sensation is capable of a diminution so that it can decrease and thus gradually disappear. And at A168, B210, in the new paragraph, Kant says, now I call that magnitude which can only be apprehended as a unity, and in which multiplicity can only be represented through approximation to negation is 0, intensive magnitude. Thus, every reality in the appearance has intensive magnitude, that is a degree. Okay, now that is sort of, I think, what Kant wants to prove, but he is going to go on to say a lot more here in the Anticipations of Perception, and some of it is very interesting, so let's read on. Here we go. At A169, B211, in the new paragraph, Kant tells us that the property of magnitudes, on account of which no part of them is the smallest, is called their continuity. Right? So Kant tells us that it's sort of an a priori given, that any sensation that we have, like, allows of continuous decrease. Right? A continuous decrease towards 0. Whatever, if there's still some sensation left, it can always become less without becoming 0. Right? So there's this continuity. This is maybe not continuity in sort of the strict mathematical sense that we use today, but it's I think clear enough for our purposes. So their continuity. Now I think I would like to stress here that this claim by itself does not commit Kant to the claim that every degree of every sensation can actually be experienced. Right? So for instance, if you read this and you think, wow, this doesn't fit quantum theory or something like that, I'm not sure it doesn't fit quantum theory, but let's suppose that it doesn't fit quantum theory in the sense that, you know, maybe there definitely could be a quantum theory that tells us that you can sense only, let's say, certain quantized degrees of a certain sensation, right? It's just physically impossible. There exists nothing with an intensity between 0 and 1 on some particular scale, and nothing with an intensity between 1 and 2. Does that prove that Kant is wrong? No, it doesn't prove that Kant is wrong. I mean, Kant is telling us that we can sort of treat things like we can conceive. It makes sense to conceive of this magnitude as varying continuously, even if, you know, maybe the actual physics of the world never exemplifies that, never makes that happen. Okay, in fact, we can recognize those gaps, right? We can even treat them as magnitudes and say, hey, there's 0 and there's 1, and anything between 0 and 1, it can't appear in our physics. Okay, this was amenable to treatment as a magnitude. So I don't think that Kant would have to be worried about anything like that. Although a little bit later on, Kant goes on to make what seems to be a much, much stronger claim. Right, so this is at A171, B, just where B213 starts. Kant says, now if all appearances, considered extensively as well as intensively, are continuous magnitudes, then the proposition that all alteration is also continuous could be proved here easily and with mathematical self-evidence. Right? And this seems to be the much stronger claim that would contradict any kind of quantum theory. If all alteration is continuous, well, that means that there are no leaps, right? That you don't go from one to another without going through the space in between. And apparently Kant thinks that you can prove easily and with mathematical self-evidence that that can't happen, that it must be continuous. If the causality of an alteration in general did not lie entirely beyond the boundaries of a transcendental philosophy and presuppose empirical principles. So Kant immediately takes it away and says, well, you maybe could treat that, maybe you could prove that, but definitely not in this book, because it requires empirical principles, and I'm not interested in that here. Okay, so we can leave that there. Now, Kant then goes on a relatively lengthy and I think very fascinating discussion of the vacuum. So here Kant takes issue with one of the fundamental assumptions, maybe one could also almost say the fundamental assumption, of the physics of Descartes and of the physics of a lot of the people who come after Descartes, even if they don't follow Descartes in detail. So what Kant points out is that clearly everyone agrees. So actually, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it is one of the, even though Descartes wouldn't say precisely what I'm going to say right now, it's nevertheless a principle of Descartes that Kant is going to take issue with. What everybody has to agree with, right, is that different substances have different densities. Right? Water weighs more than oil, but it weighs less than iron. Right? The same volume of water weighs more than the same volume of oil, but less than the same volume of iron. How can we explain that? Now, Descartes' fundamental principle of his physics is that matter is only extension. Right? The only thing, the only property that matter has is that it is extended. So it doesn't have anything else. Right? It doesn't have like a specific density, or I mean, there's not different kinds of matter or anything like that. The only thing that's there is extension. This makes it really hard. In the case of Descartes, who denies the possibility of a vacuum, it even makes it maybe almost impossible to explain different densities. This is definitely one of the problems that Descartes runs into his physics. And a lot of people coming later on would drop Descartes' rejection of the vacuum precisely to solve this problem. Right? They would say, okay, we need the vacuum. We need the vacuum because clearly what differentiates iron from water is that in iron, more of the volume is taken up by matter and less of it is taken up by empty space. And so in water there's more empty space, and in oil there's even more empty space. So we need the vacuum to explain different densities. So necessarily there is a vacuum. Right? That kind of reasoning, Kant says, maybe it's true and maybe it's not true, but what it assumes, the assumption that it's based on, is this. And here I am at A173, B215. Kant says they assume that the real in space is everywhere one and the same, and can be differentiated only according to its extensive magnitude, that is, amount. Right? And that's precisely what's happening here. Right? The real in space is everywhere one and the same. It's just matter, it's just extension. And so the difference between iron and water, if there's a difference in weight, it must be that in one of them there's just more and in the other there's just less matter, which means in one of them there's less and in the other there's more empty space. Okay, this is because you only have an extensive magnitude to work with. So the only difference that could explain a difference in weight, a difference in density, is that in one of them there's more of this extended stuff, there's more of this matter. Against this presupposition, for which they can have no ground in experience and which is therefore merely metaphysical, I oppose a transcendental proof, which to be sure will not explain the variation in the filling of space, but which still will entirely obviate the alleged necessity of the presupposition that the difference in question cannot be explained except by the assumption of empty spaces, and which has the merit of at least granting the understanding the freedom also to think of this difference in another way, if the explanation of nature should make some hypothesis necessary for this end. And so what Kant says is, look, I have just shown that everything, that the real in space, also has intensive magnitude. So it is metaphysically allowed to postulate that, there can be these different intensities of weight or impenetrability or whatever else it is that you want, that you think is there. Right? That's allowed, and that could be used to explain different densities. Maybe there's, it's not the extension, but the intensity of what's there that is different in iron and water. And Kant says, my aim here is by no means to assert that this is how it really is concerning the specific gravity of the variety of matters, but only to establish, on the basis of a principle of pure understanding, that the nature of our perceptions makes an explanation of this sort possible. And so what we see here is that Kant takes this, in many ways, apparently quite trivial claim about perception, right? There's this difference in intensities, there's always that. Now this turns out to be, because of the critical system, a fundamental principle of the possibility of objects, right? I mean, all objects must allow for this, all the objects of experience must allow for this. And that means that the assumption that only extensive magnitudes exist in nature, that's not an assumption that we can get from metaphysics. And Kant says, well, you can't get it from anywhere else, right? This must be a metaphysical presupposition. It's not empirical. I mean, how could it be empirical? And so Kant says, anyone who's given this kind of proof for the vacuum, I mean, maybe they're right about the vacuum. Maybe they're even right in their theory of density. But this is not a good proof, right? Because this proof is built on a metaphysical principle that we have no reason to adopt. And in fact, we have a lot of reason to adopt the opposite. We know that the opposite is true, so it could conceivably be the case that the vacuum has to be explained through different intensities of matter or whatever it is that we want to talk about, not different extensions. Okay, so I think that is fascinating because Kant is here taking this ultra abstract story that he's telling and really intervening in an important and well-known discussion in physics. So it turns out that, abstract though this may be, it is not irrelevant even to our scientific thinking. Okay. So let me end by reading out the last sentence of the section. It is remarkable that we can cognize a priori in magnitudes in general only a single quality, namely continuity, but that in all quality we can cognize a priori nothing more than their intensive quantity, namely that they have a degree and everything else is left to experience. So Kant points out that, like, when we think about magnitudes, like quantities in general, all we see is that they have a specific quality, which is that they are continuous, right? That is what we've been, what we know about space and time. But that when we think about quality, right, brightness or painfulness, like those kinds of qualities, what we can cognize a priori is only this, that they will have a specific kind of quantity, right, an intensive magnitude. Okay, I don't know whether that's sort of like important, but Kant thinks it's fun to point out. It's this going together in a weird way of quantity and quality. So let's leave the anticipations of perception there, as Kant does. The next part of the chapter is the very long part known as the analogies of experience, in which Kant talks about substance, in which Kant talks about causality, and in which Kant talks about community, this reciprocal relation of things that will turn out to exist at the same time. This is really, I would say, the heart of this part of the book. And I say that in part because I think it's very interesting myself, but also if you look at how much like people have talked about it, how much has been written about it, how much has been thought about it. It's the analogies of experience, and especially the second analogy, the one about causation, that has attracted loads and loads of attention. And so we will want to be looking at that in some detail in the very near future.